Skidmore is in Saratoga Springs, New York, in case you don't know exactly where these years it happens to be. And I'm very happy to be here. You'll notice a lot of similar motifs turning up in my discussion, which will be focused on Garcia Marquez and the novels. And there was so much culinary commentary this morning that I couldn't help thinking of my favorite way to do bananas, which is a very rapid dessert. You just slice it, melt some butter in a pan, toss the banana in, it caramelizes, chop some nuts, and you're done. And for to kill yourself and the family, you just add dulce de leche and it's all over. Otherwise, it's fine. And so I'm talking about Garcia Marquez and bananas in that particular fiction, starting, of course, from the United Fruit Company. And for an evil octopus, a green and yellow monster, the United Fruit Company has made out in the literary world. It has been attacked by the very best authors that Latin America or the world has had on offer, with more venom by more Nobel laureates than Anaconda Copper or Standard Oil or even McDonald's. From Miguel Ángel Asturias, who had his Nobel in 1967, through Pablo Neruda, who had his in 1971, to Garcia Márquez in 1982. If that were advertising or product placement, it would cost. But now we find that United Fruit has changed its name. There might be a reason for that. Were it not for Gabriela Mistral and Octavio Paz, it might be laid down as a rule that if you're Latin American and you want a Nobel Prize for Literature, attack United Fruit. Look what happened to Borges, no attack, no prize. This is a company with literary legs and a literary lineage that includes Asturias' Banana Company trilogy of novels from the 1950s, Strong Wind, The Green Pope, The Eyes of the Interred, and Jean Del Beato talks rather well about Asturias' novels in that other article recommended in your packet. Pablo Neruda's poem, The United Fruit Company, from Contamination in 1950, which is in your packet. Ramon Amaya Amador's Green Prison, untranslated so far as I've seen, from Honduras in 1957. And from the 1960s, Álvaro Cepeda Samudio's La Casa Grande, and of course, the Banana Company strike and massacre in Garcia Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Álvaro and Gabriel being two of the four friends at the end of 100 Years of Solitude. Garcia Márquez's novel has made that massacre as familiar as those of Boston in 1770, or Peterloo in 1819, or Amritsar in 1919, or Tlatelolco in 1968, or Tiananmen Square in 1989. The novel gives the chapter title to Mr. Keppel's Banana Massacre. It sent Catherine Lerown in her packet to the Banana Zone to generate a new history of the region and its people, and it gives Gerald Martin, Garcia Márquez's excellent new biographer, the starting point for his first two chapters. Like an octopus, the literary questions raised by bananas in Garcia Márquez's novel snake in many directions: biographical, formal, political, historical, even linguistic. But the topic has its own Aristotelian plot arc, which I will follow. It begins in Garcia Márquez's biography, since, as the world knows, the author was raised by his grandparents in the least important and most isolated of the three major towns of the Santa Marta Banana Zone in northern Colombia, very well described by Perón. Its middle is his early fictions, climaxing in 100 Years of Solitude, and the ending, or denouement, bifurcates into the impact that the novel's account has had in the world and the use Garcia Márquez has made of his novel in writing his memoir. So first, has anyone here not read 100 Years of Solitude? Okay. Those of you who haven't, have one of the world's great treats still in store. It is an extraordinary and wonderful experience. And we actually, the rest of us who have read it, envy you because you have that to look forward to as an experience. So those of us who have, and let me remind ourselves that this is quite a magical novel. It takes the history of a town, Macondo, and a family, the Buendias, from their origins sometime in post-colonial Latin America to their annihilation in a mighty apocalyptic wind in an unspecified moment somewhere around the 1960s, when the novel was written, between 1965 and 1966, and published in 1967. The entire history of Western man is science, philosophy, literature, music, technology, politics, theology, economics, violence spins past in discrete, tessellated, recognizable bits of reality, highly patterned, everything repeats or is mirrored. That's one of the characteristics of the style of the fiction. As the bizarre, idiosyncratic, yet utterly recognizable and infinitely analyzable characters go about exploring and planting and inventing and reproducing and fighting civil wars and reading and writing and organizing banana strikes and suffering heartbreak, murder, rage, and lots of lust and death until they vanish when the last of the Buendias discovers that the history of his line and his town has all been written down 100 years earlier in intertwined Sanskrit codes, that's the doubling again, by the gypsy Melchiades. And as the last living Buendia reads the history, we readers too are just finishing. His world and manuscript and our book come to an end simultaneously and forever and ever as the novel is reread. So, how do bananas fit into this story? I'm here for the bananas. Bananas, the Banana Company, and the workers' strike in the Banana Zone in 1928 are a very large hunk of the real, carefully stitched into the text. García Márquez was born the year before the strike, during the agitation that preceded it in 1927 in Aracataca, Colombia, a small town in the Banana Zone in the old Banana Zone, the new Banana Zone being actually sort of to the west. That area of northern Colombia, colonized by United Fruit, which was incorporated in 1899 by a merger of two American banana companies. That area of northern Colombia was colonized in the first decades of the 20th century. As his novel tells us, and that film clip gave you quite a good idea, the company constructed an irrigation network, and that clip gives you a very good image, I think, of the change in the waters there that first time. Constructed an irrigation network, maintained its own railroad, telegraph network, retail stores, and fleet to carry bananas to the US and goods to sell to its stores in the zone. It owned about 30,000 acres, and in this particular region, it had about 18,000 employees, principally contracted as labor through subcontractors, much as US agriculture still uses immigrant and contract labor in its fields in California and elsewhere. The arrival of the company generated a great flush of prosperity that faded in the 1930s in the Great Depression, and that coincided with a strike by banana workers in the zone in 1928. That strike culminated in the Army's firing on a crowd of workers assembled at the Cienega train station, and then imposing martial law for 4 months. The episode generated a national political upheaval, including a congressional investigation and the ousting of the conservative party from power for the first time in a generation. This all happened when García Márquez was a year old, so he didn't see it, but he heard about it from his family. His grandfather, Colonel Nicolás Marquez, having been one of the witnesses in the investigation. García Márquez's family had come to Aracataca with the banana fever, but he grew up in its aftermath, in the collapse of the prosperity of the banana company, after the strike of 1928, after the spread of Panama disease. So, in García Márquez's writing about his own childhood in town, the banana company represents not only American imperialism and the exploitation of workers, and a tale told by his grandfather about the Army's firing on assembled workers in the Cienega train station, but also the great period of the town's prosperity, his family's consequence, his mother's romance with the telegraph operator who came to town in the banana rush later than his mother's family had. That's the story of love with Frank Clara. And that author's childhood in the house of his grandparents. The storytelling grandmother and the grandfather colonel who fought in the War of 1,000 Days. So it's a multiple, it's a double relationship. In the novel, the banana company moves into Macondo and occupies its outskirts for 4 chapters, the 12th through the 15th. And the banana massacre is structurally unique. It is the single episode, historical or otherwise, to receive an entire chapter, the 15th of 20, the 3/4 mark of the book. As political representation, the episode parallels and balances Colonel Aureliano Buendia's 20 years of civil war, in which Colombia's 19th century War of 1,000 Days becomes simultaneously La Violencia of the 1950s and 60s, and the time frames merge at that point. But the massacre of strikers focuses on a single set of events rather than an ongoing struggle spread over a generation. It is the pivotal moment of the novel's second half, and it's stands out stridently in tone, communicating a double horror in its aftermath, unlike anything else in the fiction. The rage that you can actually feel in Mary's voice, and this section has been reproduced in your packet as well, the kind of anger, real fury in the narrative tone at that point, which is unlike anything else, as also some of the images that the episode telling produces. The numbers of dead carried away on a fantastic train, and the desperately realistic disappearances after the Mars massacre, in which people are arrested and simply vanish, and the army claims no knowledge of their whereabouts. It is no accident that the way Garcia Márquez told the tale has made the episode iconic. This is the industrialization of violence, aptly located at a railroad station rather than under a tree or against a wall, and it is the invention of modern disappearances of conventional Latin American history in the 1960s and 70s. So in the novel, you can't miss it. It stands out. And what remains of Macondo after the company's departure is shadowed by the massacre and the company's absence, until finally the workers, the massacre, and the company all wind up in the same place. None of them exists. For the courts and the company, there were no workers. For the town and the army, there was no massacre. And finally, for the town, there was never any banana company at all. Quote, the banana company never existed. And I understand this afternoon you're going to learn the banana doesn't exist anymore either. Okay, and that's coming up. Okay. So covertly, biographically, as source material transformed, the banana company is actually in the text from the very beginning, though it doesn't appear to be. To put it more precisely, from the memories or materials Garcia Márquez uses to create the book's opening, he has removed the associations, the biographical associations, with the banana company. The text itself discloses no banana company affiliations, but it is built from experiences linked in Garcia Márquez's biography to the company. The company makes its actual appearance, formal appearance, in the 7th chapter, a third of the way through. And so it seems to have nothing at all to do with the book's opening or its famous first line. I thought actually to ask that we recite this in unison. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. And the translation is actually marvelous, because of course in the Spanish, discover ice is conocer, so it's to meet, to make the acquaintance of. And Rabasa, that translation, using the word discover, does quite a wonderful thing to get that sense of discovery and newness in there in the English in a way that it actually isn't in the Spanish. So looking at the beginning also of the next sentence, at that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses. There's no sign of the banana company here, but the remembered moment, the day the gypsies brought the ice, originates in the day Garcia Márquez's grandfather took him to see the ice around a shipment of fish to the banana company commissary, across the street from his grandparents' house in Aracataca. So it's a banana company commissary that has the ice originally in life. That very fish and shellfish in boxed of ice will be shipped to Amaranta Ursula in the last days of Macondo. In the next sentence, Macondo, the name of that mythical invented town, is the real name of a real banana plantation visible on historical maps of the region. I was quite excited when I saw it on a map for the first time. About 10 minutes outside of Aracataca on the train line. As a town, Macondo is an invention. But as a place name, it is real, the real name of a banana finca. The massacre of striking banana workers, placed in the invented town of Macondo, took place in the real town of Cienega, a neighboring town to the real Aracataca on the same train line. The narrator calls Macondo's reality, quote, an intricate stew of truths and mirages, and the chopping up bits of the real and bits of the invented to cook together is one way the novel works. Now, in 1967, when the novel was published, following Neruda, Asturias, and Maya Amador, it was clear that the banana company summed the evils of American imperialism tied up in one bunch of fruit. Garcia Márquez's account is more nuanced than that, but the company is certainly alien and associated from the beginning with violence. That otherness appears at the most basic linguistic level. In English, a banana is a banana is a banana. But the novel uses the lexical resources of Caribbean Spanish to erect a linguistic banana barrier between Macondo and the Americans. So if one's students have Spanish, they can have a good deal of fun with the differences translation makes. For example, Rabasa always translates malanga as caladium. So he takes a tuber and puts it into an ornamental plant, which is really quite bizarre the way that works. And of course, the audience is differentiated to us and them by which of the items of foodstuffs you recognize and use in your kitchen and which you don't. So it's very interesting. So anyways, when they were first introduced, bananas lead the list of what Ursula grows in the first days of the town. And this is Rabasa's translation. Banana and caladium, cassava and yams, aoyama roots and eggplants. We know banana and eggplants, cassava and yams, sort of southern, right, in Africa, right? Caladium and aoyama roots. Some of us may know them, but that sort of tells you who's who if you know, if you've eaten an aoyama. They reappear in the Insomnia play when Jose Arcadio Buendia pastes labels on things so that one will know how to call them. And bananas end one such list. You have the list of, quote, cow, goat, pig, hen, cassava, there's the caladium again, banana. Okay, but in Spanish, Ursula and Jose Arcadio Buendia are not planting and labeling bananas at all. In Spanish, Ursula, the matriarch, plants plátano, and the patriarchal Jose Arcadio Buendia labels the foodstuff threatened by insomnia, guineo, different varieties. And I noticed in your grocery stores here at Trenicos, you have lots and lots of different kinds of bananas. When the banana company appears, however, it is the Compañía Bananera, and Mr. Herbert's first bunch of bananas is a racimo de bananos, as is his second. When he takes out his calipers to section the fruit, he sections a banano. The gringos plant a banano, and the banana plague is a peste del banano. Like his father, however, when Colonel Aureliano Buendia laments the changes in the town and attributes them to our inviting, quote, a gringo to eat some bananas, he does not say banano, but guineo, as his father did. So Garcia Marquez reserves the word banano, source of our banana, for bananas as they are associated with the banana company. What the people eat and plant has other names. Imagine no line of language. Like everything else in the novel, the company makes the proleptic appearance in chapter 7 before it actually arrives 100 pages later in chapter 12. It appears to be doing a good deed, though the context is ominous. The corpse of Jose Arcadio, Rebecca's murdered spouse, reeks of powder even after it is buried, and many years later, engineers from the banana company cover the grave with a concrete shell. So the banana company performs a service that the people have been unable to perform for themselves, getting rid of the stench of a murder. But the moment also registers as a cover-up, connected with an unsolved murder over power and property. Ultimately, the company will be identified with violence against striking workers that is also covered up. So obliterated violence marks the company's entrance and its exit. When the event foretold finally happens, we learn the company covering the body with a shell was merely pursuing its own interests. Now possessed of the powers of divine providence, the company changes the pattern of the rains, accelerates the harvest, and moves the river, that's the irrigation network, of course, with its white stones to the other side of town behind the cemetery. It builds the concrete shell so the smell of powder does not, quote, contaminate the waters. On the one hand, nuancing, the company is suspected to be, quote, actually nothing but philanthropists. But on the other, the company is soon linked to tyranny, violence, and murder. It's hired assassins with machetes and, quote, replace the old policeman with clubs, decapitate a grandfather and mince his grandson, and some unknown parties massacre 16 of the 17 Aurelianos after Colonel Aureliano Buendia threatens to arm his boys to get rid of the shitty gringos, while revolution in promise. The one Aureliano who survives until the penultimate chapter is Aureliano Amador, whose name ought to be a tribute to Ramon Amaya Amador, the Honduran author of The Green Prison. Amador had fled Honduras for Guatemala, and then Guatemala for Argentina, when a US-sponsored pro-United Company coup toppled Guatemala's arbands, and he died in a plane crash in 1966, just as the novel was being written. If he's not alluded to in that name, which Garcia Marquez had used in earlier fictions, he ought to be, so it should be. So the strike and workers' massacre in 1928 encountered in chapter 15, have received enough critical attention from me, from Jean Bell, Viada, from Catherine Legrand, that there's no longer any real need to demonstrate that Garcia Márquez's account, founded on careful reading and research, is fundamentally accurate, as we say. That's been done. Whenever anyone heads out into the field to learn about bananas, or the banana zone, or the strike, or the massacre, or the responses today of people in the zone, they find confirmation of the novel. And they usually select to tell you the details the novel selected for them. This is not only an example of what psychologists call confirmation bias. We see what we expect to, we learn what we already know, but in some cases the novel has actually created the external reality researchers find, just as I may have created an allusion to a Maya on my door. So I'd like to look at Garcia Márquez's slanting of his material, his art in constructing the episode. He omits the episode's admirable political consequences, the congressional investigation and hearings led by Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, the company's yielding on several contested points, and the Liberal Party's return to power. Those vanish. He arranges his account of the labor contest so that the final emphasis falls on a real absurdity, not an invented one. The court's determination that the company has no workers. Then as now, in California, as in Colombia, among the most effective ways of avoiding protective legislation is to hire workers through subcontractors. Then one has no employees of one's own, and the state can make whatever labor laws it likes. None will apply to the company with no workers. One of the other thing he does is sort of slow down the temporal time frame, so that there were 2 strikes 10 years apart. He doubles them still, but has them quite close together. Fiddling with the facts of massacre and martial law, Garcia Márquez changes the time of day and the number of the decree read at the station, chooses the highest contemporary estimate for the numbers of dead, and invents that phantasmagoric, hallucinatory image of trains loaded with dead going to the sea, with dead in them like bunches of bananas. Let me give one example of the way Garcia Márquez closely follows but also distorts his sources. When he describes the workers' interference with strike-breaking scabs sabotaging the sabotage before the massacre, he paraphrases General Cortes Vargas's decree number 4, declaring martial law in the region after the massacre. The general is named in the novel, and he published his own defensive account of events in 1929, probably because of the investigations. And actually, this is actually in your text. So it might be easier if I was hearing. I hadn't actually asked to have this included, but it's so nice that it's there. Page 304, you'll see before your very eyes. Let's see, so the second section, page 304, left, right-hand page, English professors, you have to see it on the page. The second to last paragraph here, the decree number 4 had been signed by General Carlos Cortes Vargas and his secretary, Major Enrique Garcia Isasa, and the 3 articles, 80 words with various drivers, a bunch of reasons, and the authorized army shoot to kill. That is the point at which he actually refers to the general. And now, oh yes, okay, and just above that, on page 303, this is the sentence. So in the middle of the paragraph beginning martial law in the middle of the army. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The description of the sabotage, the soldiers cutting the bananas, the workers beginning to sabotage the sabotage. And Garcia Márquez's sentence is, they burned plantations and commissaries, tore up tracks to impede the passage of the trains that began to open their path with machine gun fire, and they cut telegraph and telephone wires. The items in the syntax echo Cortes Vargas, whom you don't have in front of you, but in him they, quote, burned various national and foreign buildings, the national plantations and the foreign commissaries, would be national farm buildings, plantations, and commissaries, pillaged, cut telegraph and telephone communications, destroyed rail lines. Cortes Vargas does not mention trains opening their way with machine gun fire, and his next sentence accuses the strikers of attacking peaceful citizens and committing assassinations. But the syntax and the items are the same. Garcia Marquez's next sentence affirms only that the irrigation ditches were stained with blood. There are dead, there is blood, but Garcia Marquez's passive syntax erases subjects and responsibility and leaves the blood to the ground. The victims could be strikers, assassinated by the machine guns already mentioned, or peaceful citizens, assassinated by strikers, as Cortes Vargas would have it, or irascible citizens caught in the crossfire, or all of the above. But the machine guns make it far more likely we will think of the strikers as victims rather than as perpetrators. This is a grammar lesson in the passive voice as political activism. There was always a point to Garcia Marquez's inaccuracies. When he claims that decree number 4 was written at the station, rather than the unimportant decree number 1 in order to disperse, he directs readers to that decree, issued the day after the massacre, and justifying martial law. The inaccuracy draws critical attention to a decree quoted several times, explicitly and implicitly, that might otherwise be missed. Then there was the time of day. According to Cortes Vargas and Rebolledo, the order to disperse came at 1 a.m. Even in Macondo, it is dark at 1 a.m. And even in Macondo, it might not be unreasonable to demand that a crowd disperse after midnight. Garcia Marquez puts the order at 3 p.m. in the glare of day. This is an atrocity to be seen and an unreasonable demand to make. Demanding at 1 a.m. that a crowd disperse seems almost justifiable. Making the same demand at midday seems an arbitrary abuse of power. Then he inflates the numbers of dead. Cortes Vargas admitted 9 people killed at the station and another 31 in the operations afterwards, totaling 40. Garcia Marquez claims that he exaggerated to, quote, fit the proportions of the novel. So instead of hundreds, I upped it to thousands. He could also have cited some contemporary news accounts that did give such numbers. But an important and slurry point is that for us to take the massacre seriously these days, we need more than 5 dead from the Boston massacre, or 15 from Piru, or even the 300 that Amritsar. We need Tiananmen Square numbers. And Garcia Marquez supplies them 22 years before the fact. Finally, he exploits point of view. So the narrator does not stand behind the numbers or the train, but a character does. It's not usually pointed out that it is not the narrator who describes what happens at the station or sees the train loaded with dead. It is Jose Arcadio Segundo and a child on Jose Arcadio Segundo's shoulders. So you have those 2 points of view working simultaneously in the account. If we had more time to do this, in this good classroom exercise, to go through, to ask who is telling the story at any given point, and to mark how the universe and the focus change from sentence to sentence. I will not do that to you, but it is I can clearly see how that would work in these passages here. The episode alternates between the narrator's point of view and his virulent hatred of the army's Cachambas, sons of the same bitch, he calls them. That's actually here. Yeah, it's at the very bottom of 302. And it's really a unique moment in the rhetoric of the novel as a whole, I think. The bottom of 302, the regiment marched by, short, stocky, and wood-like. They perspired with the sweat of a horse. There's a smell of sun-tanned hide, and the taciturn and impenetrable perseverance of men from the uplands. They were all, I'm speaking 2 lines here, they were all identical, sons of the same bitch, and with the same stolidity, they all bore the weight of their packs and canteens, the shame of their rifles with fixed bayonets, and the chancre of blind obedience and a sense of honor. It's a very strange tone, I think, that's being given to us. Again, that is the narrator at this point. But when the massacre begins, that angry, omniscient narrator vanishes, replaced by a much calmer, limited point of view. What happens at the station is told only as the characters see it, the boy, the child, and Jose Arcadio Segundo. And this remains true for the rest of the novel. this device turns the quote, reality of the events at the train station into a tale told. Jose Arcadio Segundo's and Aureliano's version become a contest of narratives between Jose Arcadio Segundo and the town, history, officials, in which Jose Arcadio Segundo's version is as invisible as he himself is when the soldiers come looking for him and cannot see him in the room of Marquez. Isolated with his terrible knowledge or his illusory belief, he lacks all social validation. His account is nowhere corroborated. No one confirms or supports his experience and knowledge until Aureliano Babilonio meets Gabriel, who has also received the story from his great-granduncle, Coronel Marquez, Colonel Aureliano Buendia's comrade in arms and one-time suitor of Amaranta. So the massacre is situated in the novel as a tale told, believed by some, denied by most others, affirmed with his dying breath by a self-incarcerated and obsessed, almost madman who cries, "Never forget," when everyone has long ago forgotten. The contest between oblivion and memory continues to the end of the novel, where oblivion wins, but also loses, since we have the story. Oblivion also marks the terrifyingly familiar account of military violence in the aftermath, the after-mowing of martial law, the deliberate eradication of labor organizers, quoting criminal later. At night after taps, they knocked doors down with their rifle butts, hauled suspects out of their beds, and took them off on trips from which there was no return. The military denied it even to the relatives of the victims who crowded the commandant's office in search of news. "You must have been dreaming," the officers insisted. "Nothing has happened in Macondo. This is a happy town." In that way, they were finally able to wipe out the union leaders. Specifying union leaders linked the army's violence to the company. Yet once the Banana Company disappears, it is clear that Macondo is not better off for the Banana Company's absence. If it had, quote, peace after many years, from Aureliano Babilonia's point of view, it is also poor. Critics forget that the last charge against the company is the reason it calls down the deluge. The deluge, of course, is divine providence in action once again, a 4-year deluge followed by a 10-year drought, symbolizing disease and global depression, if you like. But it calls down that deluge in order to avoid fulfilling its promises to its workers. What the workers killed at the station wanted was not the pulling out, or the expulsion, or the expropriation of the Banana Company, but for the Banana Company to claim them as its workers, to acknowledge them, to embrace them, to become their employer. Rather than a simplistic anti-imperialism, Garcia Márquez represents complex relationships between foreign companies and nationals, and among various national constituencies relative to foreign companies, central governments and armies, local oligarchs and workers, young intellectuals and fiction writers. The more complex relations Legrand lays out in her piece are so very well, are all already there to be teased out by readers. The Banana Company is a source of prosperity, of annihilated splendor, and it too is ultimately enveloped in the web of nostalgia. The gringos within their electrified fence, surrounded by German shepherds, feasting on Virginia ham and pineapple slices, sincerely admire Mene's performances on the clavichord and forge friendly relations with the occasional member of a leading local family, such as Mene. And the last grandfather of a Buendia is a Banana Company mechanic. The company brings the banana plague, but that plague is prosperity and connectedness, the raft and the train. And when it leaves, prosperity abandons the town, leaving a hulk, a wreck behind. Just as a carnival massacre precedes the banana massacre, so a forgotten Spanish imperialism precedes the not yet forgotten North American one. The first Jose Arcadio Buendia discovers a skeleton in armor with a locket containing a woman's hair, and then a Spanish galleon hung with orchids, later burned out and covered in poppies, when the burned out Colonel Aureliano Buendia finally sees it. Many years later, when Macondo was in ruins, and the Banana Company had torn down its installations and gone, quote, the only human trace was a glove belonging to Patricia Brown in an automobile smothered in wild pansies. Two forms of imperialism vanished, leaving a characteristic vehicle, a galleon or an automobile, and a memento of lost love, a locket or a glove. The Banana Company's ambiguity even evokes a mirroring nostalgia in its last appearance, in its final erasure. Quote, the Banana Company's city, which Patricia Brown, may have tried to evoke for her grandchildren during the nights of intolerance and dill pickles in Prattville, Alabama, was a plain of wild grass. The wise Catalan returned to Spain, also found himself facing two nostalgias like mirrors. But of course, he didn't return to Prattville, bananas, slipping on banana peels, and dill pickles. There remains a tart comedy in that invented memory of North American nostalgia, which I've heard some, and a political edge, obviously, in intolerance. Macondo is in ruins when the company leaves, as Regina points out, but it is certainly not finished. A quarter of the novel lies ahead, peopled by returnees to and from Europe. Jose Arcadio, the homosexual, who rebelled against the plan to make him Pope, and whose murder after the discovery of hidden gold suggests modern drug violence. The wise Catalan and the four friends who wander away to foreign parts, the dynamic Amaranta Ursula and her Belgian husband, whose frustrated efforts to establish an airmail service remind us that Colombia had one of the earliest air services in the Americas or the world, inaugurated in 1919, a decade before Pan American. To say that the Banana Company finishes Macondo and silences its people is to ignore a good chunk of the book, the last quarter. It is also to ignore the book itself in the reader's hands, which certainly speaks for Macondo, a decade of other books and stories Garcia Marquez wrote before 100 Years of Solitude, and of course all the other Latin American literature that preceded it, some of which the text itself refers to. Macondo's prosperity certainly vanishes with the company, but it is paradoxically more in communication with the rest of the world, less solitary and isolated than it was in its idyllic past. Insisting there is more than one story to be told about the Banana Company differentiates Garcia Marquez's work from Neruda's, a Chilean writing from the other end of the continent. Though Garcia Marquez gives us the company as the people see it, the communist Neruda looks at the company from the top down. He starts from God and descends through the dictators to the anonymous, nameless people fallen into the abyss. And that poem by Neruda is in the packet. And would anyone like to read it in Spanish, and the rest of us can sort of read along in English on the other side? Please.
You can read it in Spanish.
Please, thank you.
Cuando sonó la trompeta, estuvo todo preparado en la tierra, y Jehová repartió el mundo a Coca-Cola Inc., Anaconda, Ford Motors y otras entidades. La compañía frutera Inc. se reservó lo más jugoso, la costa central de mi tierra, la dulce cintura de América. Bautizó de nuevo sus tierras como repúblicas bananas, y sobre los muertos dormidos, sobre los héroes inquietos que conquistaron la grandeza, la libertad y las banderas, estableció la ópera bufa, en ajeno los albedríos, regaló coronas de César, desenvainó la envidia, atrajo la dictadora de las moscas, moscas Trujillos, moscas Tachos, moscas Carías, moscas Martínez, moscas Cúbico, moscas húmedas, de sangre humilde y mermelada, moscas borrachas que zumban sobre las tumbas populares, moscas de circo, sabias moscas entendidas en tiranía. Entre las moscas sanguinarias, la frutera desembarca, arrasando el café y las frutas en sus barcos que deslizaron como bandejas el tesoro de nuestras tierras sumergidas. Mientras tanto, por los abismos azucarados de los puertos caían indios sepultados en el vapor de la mañana. Un cuerpo rueda, una cosa sin nombre, un número caído, un racimo de fruta muerta derramada en el pudridero.
Thank you very much. Like this, I've been read Spanish in a long time. Okay. So we have to start in the last judgment at the end of the world, or perhaps a racetrack, when the trumpet sounded. The Protestant God, Jehovah, so we were out of the Protestant Bibles, divides up the earth among Coca-Cola, Chile's own Anaconda Copper, Ford Motors. United Fruit gets the juiciest, the sweet, sensual waste, including Panama, which was part of Colombia until 1903, when the U.S. fostered an insurrection, when the Colombian Senate refused to grant U.S. territory in perpetuity for the canal. That's Barrio de Panama. Among the sleeping dead, the unquiet heroes, we may recognize such personalities as Colonel Buendia. In the comic opera, the distraction of the people, the envy unsheathed. Perhaps there's a trace of the banana plague, the black-coated lawyers, the prosperity of some, and the anxiety of all. With the naming of the flies, the bloody flies, the sugary flies, Trujillo from the Dominican Republic, Carillas from Honduras, Rico from Guatemala. The tone changes to contempt, mixed with horror and disgust. And the last image, falling Indians disappearing in the mist, parodies a traditional last judgment. It is the virtuous, not the vicious, who plunge downward, where the flies circle and buzz, alighting on the rotting bodies of fruit and men. And of course, one of the names of the devil is Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies. The victims are anonymous. The oppressors, however, are rich and famous and renowned all the way back to Rome, a banana-free republic. God stands condemned, and there is no moment of desire within the poem. Nothing to want. Neruda gives us a visceral distaste for united fruit. Its creepiness is enough to put us off bananas. The company brings nothing, it simply takes away treasure. Such political and economic relations continue to obtain in many parts of the world. Change the names of the flies and the sharers. Let the workers fall from unexpected scaffolding in New York City, or be buried alive to die in United States mines. While they survive in similar collapses in Canadian mines, it was a wonderful week. We had 20 people dead in one mine, and they had 25 people saved in another mine. It's called worker safety and regulation. Both Canada and the US have it. They enforce it. Neruda's poem keeps happening. Garcia Márquez's account is, however, more complex, in that the company's absence, not really its presence, brings decline, and it is the people who have names. Garcia Márquez's novel may have somewhat more to say to us in an era of globalization than Neruda's poem does. It has certainly had an impact on the perception of reality in the 40 years since the novel was published. There is now a statue to the fallen workers in Cienega, erected in 1978. The one deliberate and glaring, purposeful, intentional inaccuracy in Garcia Márquez's account, the 3,000 dead, has become real, accepted, quoted history. Journalists refer in passing to the thousands that died in the 1928 strike. And on a parliamentary anniversary of an event that was once largely erased and non-existent, the 3,000 dead are duly reinvented and memorialized. Even Mr. Keppel won't go below 1,000 to end a chapter. And again, a class might easily discuss why 5 or 15 or 150 don't make recent massacres, why we need at least 1,000 to pay attention to have a chapter in effect. This canonization of Garcia Márquez's number is an extraordinary tribute to the power of popular literature. The fiction actually creates and falsifies history after it restores to historical consciousness an episode that has been consigned to national and regional oblivion. Even traces of the oblivion are carefully preserved when they turn up. In August 1982, Jean Delviada visited Oaxaca and met a retired United Fruit Company employee who had no truck with the massacre. Asked about the strikers, the old employee debunked a lot. Quote, "Look, those people only caused problems and ruined everything. And let me tell you, all that stuff about massacres or whatever, it's all just a story. Lies, it never happened. The most I heard of was 2 guys shot. Look, if there really were all those dead, then you tell me where they dumped the corpses." Even General Cortes Vargas allowed that 9 people had been killed at the station. This guy has it down to 2. But as in the novel, it is the older people who deny the reality of the massacre, the virtue of the strikers. And there's an ongoing conversation. The fiction also contaminates the history it creates. It seeds the terms in which reality is perceived. So when Catherine Legrand went to the zone to write real history, she quotes an interviewee who repudiates any attempt to represent the zone as cultural imperialist victim. He uses a phrase that may be drawn from experience, but it is certainly already written in Garcia Márquez's book. Quote, "They, the United Fruit Company, lived over there in their chicken coops." Electrified chicken coops may be a traditional deflation of the Yankees' peacock lawns, but it is a description the novel insists upon. As Garcia Márquez says, quote, "The Yankees are depicted the way the local people saw them." The local pride and sense of community that Legrand finds and points to in her article owe much to the novel's success and its rejection of helpless victimization as a rhetorical stance. The novel also contaminates Garcia Marquez's own memoir and Gerald Martin's biography. I wanted to use Garcia Marquez's memoir to explicate the role of bananas, the strike, and the massacre in the novel, on the excellent principle that an author's work is best explicated by another of his works. The memoir opens spilling over with references to the Banana Company and to the massacre. If you've not read it, or not lately, the memoir begins with the visit Garcia Marquez made with his mother in 1950 to sell the house in Aracataca, the event that gave him the idea and the desire to write the story that would become 100 Years of Solitude after his leaf storm and several other stories. The memoir bubbles with phrases and descriptions and events that call the novel, including an extraordinary evocation of the quote, ephemeral splendor of the Banana Company, crystallized in the decrepitude of the train going to Aracataca. Nostalgia and desire quite overcome political outrage. And of course, it's very likely that Garcia Marquez has softened in the 40 years since he wrote the novel and now. At the Cienega station, his mother says, quote, "That is where the world ended." And Garcia Marquez recounts the moment in the square as a story repeated 1,000 times by his grandfather. It is very cleverly done. He looks at a square that couldn't hold more than 200 people, no more than 200, and then recites the story of the thousands gathered, the order to fire, and the sound of the guns, all under the blazing sun. So we see the story, as it's told in 100 Years of Solitude, is a gift not of memory or research, but of a story recited. The next paragraph turns to the train, and the reader of the novel thinks immediately of the train carrying thousands of bodies on its way to the sea. But no, this is the train of the present, the dismal, dilapidated, sad, late train of the present trip in 1950. Along this route, people want the Banana Company to return. All the decay, poverty, listlessness, even the heat, it seems, is the fault not of the company, but the company's departure. Only a traveling priest says that, quote, "The company leaves ruin wherever it goes." But two women quarrel with him, and a woman with a baby insists that God cannot be in agreement with the priest. The second chapter again begins with the company, and so what greater proof of the importance of bananas could there possibly be? But then I realized that all this nostalgia for the company is nostalgia for the moment when Garcia Marquez realized what story he wanted to tell, the story of the desolated house in Aracataca and the vanished splendors of the Banana Company era. The narrator and his mother have different memories, but their relation to the sad town before them is nostalgia for another town, a town of their youth. And Garcia Marquez encloses those nostalgias with the nostalgia for the moment when the idea for the book of nostalgias would come into being. The memoir appears not to be telling its own real story, the true story of Garcia Marquez, but to be telling the story of the novel of Garcia Marquez's writings. Details appear in the memoir because they've already appeared in the fictions, and the real memoir comes to seem the unreal mirror of the fiction. Garcia Marquez has changed his memoir as artfully and practically as any of his novels, opening with his mother, closing with his wife-to-be, and proceeding by a pincer movement in which time gradually comes together and passes itself. In turn, the memoir is contaminated biography. Gerald Martin opens his first two chapters with the banana nostalgia and the banana strike, because he too is channeling Garcia Marquez's memoir, channeling 100 Years of Solitude. So this is all very good news for those advocates of poetry who thrill over poetry's power to change reality, or at least its perception. Right? The more politically conscious should also be happy that truth has emerged and triumphed over the shadows of repression, even if we have to lower the numbers of the dead. Nor should we really resent discovering that Colombian politicians did indeed investigate the events of the Banana Zone. Who really objects to believing there were fewer dead than a novelist proposes? Or the Colombians have, or once had, responsible politicians who look out for the welfare of their people. But before too much self-congratulation happens, let's consider the real usefulness or political situation of the novel and the difference between 1928 and 1967, and between 1967 and 2009. The intersection of the novel's political situations, the politics in the novel, what the novel represents as politics, and the world politics the novel found itself in on publication in 1967. That intersection exposes, as a myth, as an illusion, the idea that fiction can be of much use to present politics, but it also reveals that we need that myth, those illusions. In 1967, Garcia Márquez published a novel that took up a strike that happened 40 years earlier. Fine. The decade before, Neruda, Asturias, and Maya Amador were writing about contemporary events in Honduras, Guatemala, the whole continent, Carpentier about historical events in Haiti and the kingdom of this world in 1949. So Garcia Márquez's work situates itself in that context of such protest literature. But as it does so, it shows that the evils protested have already endured for 40 years into the present. The banana company wiped out workers in 1928, and they're still doing it in the 1950s. So the politics in the novel, by virtue of being old politics, are not optimistic about the present. They show that what is now protested has already happened, that it has been happening all along for 40 years. Worse, 4 years after Neruda's poem attacked Guatemala's Ubico, Guatemala's democratically elected president, Arbenz, is overthrown by the CIA on behalf of United Fruit in 1954, just 4 years later. So not only have things not improved in the last 40 years, they're getting progressively worse. Okay. Now it's also true that Cuba's Batista had been overthrown by Castro and Covert in 1959. And some critics have taken the apocalyptic wind that levels Macondo as the Cuban Revolution, bringing a new regime of sociality and solidarity, no more solitude, and that makes them feel a lot better. Garcia Márquez, we know, is an admirer of Fidel, so that is a possible and important reading. But even if we do consider that, however, the novel is published in 1967, and then what happens? Latin America teeters and then topples, like those Indians in Neruda's poem, into 2 decades of right-wing dictatorships, militarism, massacre, and disappearance. The 1970s and 80s were the worst periods of political repression in the histories of Argentina and Chile, and arguably for Central America, unless we count the 1920s and 30s as the worst, with US Marines in every Central American and Caribbean port collecting the nation's taxes. That was the 20s and 30s. What is the train with 3,000 dead? But the disappearing bodies of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala, not from the decade before the novel, but from the decades after. What are the denials at the police station, but the disappearances? The bodies dumped into the sea. After the novel was published in 1967, students were massacred in Mexico City in 1968. Cienega may have gotten its statue in 1978, but of course Cambodia had its killing fields. 1989 there was the Berlin Wall, but also the massacre in Tiananmen Square. An event famous in the West that really exists in China, we are told, and where reality is finally catching up to the events in Garcia Márquez's novel. So, not only does poetry make nothing happen, as Autumn has it, but in describing the horrors of the past, it merely predicts the horrors of the future. These days, an apocalyptic wind threatens Detroit, and other company towns desolate and deserted and out of work. Who needs it? We might also question talking at all about bananas, and an 80-year-old banana strike, almost 100 years old, this banana strike. The big money in Colombian agriculture these days is not in bananas, nor are the problems battering our Latin neighbors now caused by imported fruit, which I understood also paid off left-wing guerrillas as well as right-wing guerrillas when it was found out. And of course, we have a speaker later this afternoon that well, bananas are important, but certainly this is a very old banana strike. So it's a myth that recovering violence from oblivion is abused in the present. That is, it's a story we tell ourselves that has no or little basis in reality. There is no sign or evidence that knowing the truth about the past changes the future. We keep saying never again, over and over and over again. Yet obliviousness is maddening. It is very annoying when we see obliviousness. In the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago, Scott Malcolmson wrote the following couple of lines about Colombia. Quote, there are these are magical lines from the information they don't let into the sentence. There's a kind of hermetic seal that's set up around Latin America and the events of the last 40 years in the way he phrases this. It's quite extraordinary. There are young adults now who don't really remember the civil wars, yet it took a tremendous political heave to bring many Latin American countries out of the serial miseries of the late Cold War and into some semi-peace with themselves. And it was so immensely difficult to do that, might it be all too easy to slip back? That second sentence is amazing. Latin America imposed on itself the serial miseries of the late Cold War. Some nameless benefactors, some philanthropists, gave them a tremendous political heave to bring them out of their self-imposed misery. It's a brilliant sentence, completely irresponsible. It erases all responsibility and leaves Latin America locked up in a box all by itself. Malcolmson will not tamper with any American reader's historical obliviousness, self-satisfaction, sense of moralistic exceptionalism, or pure and simple ignorance. No trace of U.S. complicity can ever be gleaned from that sentence. So, fiction does not prevent murders, assassination, genocide, or exploitation, but like poetry, it is the repository of the politics of memory. It keeps us mindful of murders, assassinations, genocide, and exploitations that never go away, that always recur in their new forms, and that must still be resisted and rejected in spite of their intermittent, ineradicable successes. Past abuses provide all too plentiful analogies for the abuses of the present, but they are only analogies. We will always require being reminded, and telling the truth about the past gives us the illusion that we control the future. It makes us feel better in the present, empowered in the current term, and that has its uses. It might be the placebo effect of intellectual history, but placebos we know work 30% of the time. Okay? Without ideology, we don't get up in the morning. It may be a myth that recovering dead violence is useful, but myths are also stories we live by, and they mediate ideology for us. And in a world as violence-ridden as our own, the world as it is, has been, and will be, believing, exposing, and seeing violence will enable us to control it is a myth we need, a myth for our time. Discussion, please. Question? Answer?
I don't really quite know how to place this in the question, but the sense of literature as a kind of political, really a political tool that's quite powerful. I mean, it seems to be more true of Latin America in the stuff that we read in translation here than it is for many other areas that we read. And I wonder if that's kind of what is translated, or whether you find that Latin American literature generally tends to be kind of socially engaged.
Well, Latin American literature is socially engaged, so also is American literature. And I don't think I think it's more in the function of what's translated. But also of political consciousness. And part of it is our sense of Latin American literature really comes out of the 60s and that particular form of political turmoil of that era. So there's a very strong correlation between when we started paying attention to Latin American literature and its political content. So I think that perhaps for us that is the case, but I think that's really accidental. That if you read Indian literature or if you read African literature, you'll find just as much political engagement concerned with imperial and colonial problems in those emerging nations as well as in Latin America. I think it's really more functional.
More functional than translation, especially discussions.
Yeah. But I'm not a specialist in all of literature, but that would be my expectation. Certainly it's true of African literature.
I was wondering about like the nostalgia you're talking about, because as I was reading it, I just read it recently, knowing sort of, with like what you're talking about in the political. Do you think the character? I think to me it seems like the characters are more they lament the fact that banana company never came. I mean, Colonel really early on his comment about the gringos, and so I'm wondering, do you think like the nostalgia is not necessarily for the prosperity brought, but the fact that it even came at all, and just that period right before, it wasn't necessarily good. All the Civil War was going on. But when it talks about the devastation of the land, it talks about how wildly the people came in, how quickly they built the houses, so how easily they fell apart. And I don't know necessarily like what the nostalgia is for. To me, it seems like I don't know. I'm just wondering why, because you say it brings this complex notion of what it meant to the people, but I think that family sort of things that really curse the town.
I think the way it works in the novel the nostalgia actually is interesting because it goes to Patricia Brown. As you say, the characters themselves within the family don't feel nostalgia for it as it happens, and the characters we're focused on, except Amaranta Ursula. So that carrier of nostalgia for the town, longing for the town, memories of the town, actually goes with characters we don't focus on quite as much as the Colonel, but Amaranta Ursula and also Jose Arcadio, the one who comes back from Rome, find himself then trapped and then doesn't leave. So there's a curious way in which nostalgia as motif or theme is given to particular characters outside rather than to the family, and that the prosperity of the town during the Banana Company's presence is almost transparent to us. It's not experienced as nostalgia when it's happening, but the nostalgia of the company, the prosperity of the company is linked with the incredible fertility of Petrocotes, which introduces it. I mean, she makes all those animals reproduce, the sex or the Relano Segundo, and then the Banana Company comes right on top of that. And so that's the parallel there. And I think that's one of the ways in which, as the company is there, there's a sense of resentment for its presence, and it isn't. Nostalgia is not felt for it by the characters we're focused on, like Aureliana Babylonia, the last one.
So when she comes back from Europe, though, that idyllic picture in her mind is the actual banana town that she grew up in.
Right, but she doesn't want to leave, and she won't go away at that point. And she stays and dies there. So that's what it's. But I don't think we focus on her nostalgia quite as much as on the. I think probably those dominant male characters are more present to us in the movie. And so I think my point is that the novel's dialogic, and it's highly complex in terms of who feels what about the company and about its presence. But I think that the prosperity of it is kind of transparent. It's not something that's really focused on for us. And with the novel does it, but as we read into the identifications of the characters, that's not really focused with that.
Yeah, I was just curious about your personal background and how you got interested in Marquez, and you talked about finding the home or the original home on the map and what you had actually done in Colombia, and just a brief synopsis of how all this came to be.
I'm a specialist in 18th century British literature, as it happens, because I do a lot of different things. But I was a graduate student in the 1960s. And I, of course, I spent time in Mexico and sort of thing one does. When I was actually I went to graduate at Berkeley, and I have a lot of friends who are graduate students in economics and so on with Latin America, and went down to Chile in 1967 to teach for a while in school there, and then went to graduate school at Harvard, and was with all these English majors, and it was the 60s, it was the great period of the boom, and I really did not care for much American or English literature since Faulkner. Faulkner was divine, but after Faulkner, well, they were talking about the death of the novel among literary critics at that era, and I agreed with them. I thought that the English and American novel was, as far as I was concerned, I liked the 18th century novel much better. Thank you. Give me Fielding. But then I began reading these, and I seriously took it up as a hobby. But then, you know how scholars are when they take up hobbies. They do research. They go to Columbia. They go to Rakataka. They go to archives. And I guess I had the feeling that there was a problem that the political elements of the novel were the sort of thing that American readers would simply pass by, would not register, would not notice, would not be stopped by. They would simply read those parts of the novel as magical or as absurd as other events and happenings. And so I thought it was important to stop that. So I think she mentioned Finding Me. I did an article, and it was published in 1984. I think I had actually written it by 1980. It was one of those things that took forever actually to come out. One of the second articles on Gabriel García Márquez's politics. It's called Liberals, Conservatives, and Bananas? Something like that. Okay. And it was reprinted in a couple of places and so on. So I got serious, and it was really it was a hobby. And Skidmore is the sort of place that actually lets you do things like that. It's sort of nice. as well as other more insensitive forms supposed to. Yes.
Do you have any observations on writings that authors did in a way that would shield them from authority, dictatorship, or whatever, versus writings that authors did in a way that wasn't so direct, but for other reasons, like maybe they just thought that was a more creative way to tell the story? I don't know if that question is clear.
You're talking about censorship or self-censorship?
I'm talking about maybe in some cases they wrote because there was censorship in place, and so they had to be subtle about how they criticized what was going on. And maybe in other cases, authors didn't face censorship, but they decided to write the story in a way that was more fictional or more creative, yet trying to tell the story. I get a sense here that my sense is that Garcia Márquez wasn't really at risk of facing any retribution for what he wrote. Yet there's an aspect to me of not simply coming out and making a statement of what he thought should happen or should have happened. He wove it into a story and told it that way.
I think on the ground, perhaps, that, as pointed out, when you put these things in fictional form, they become much easier to read, and they then have the possibility of becoming iconic, being used as centers for other writers and readers and teachers to use and to focus on, and where you can then sort of spring out and go in different directions from them. I think Latin American writers probably solved the problem of censorship at home by going abroad and traveling. And I got one, they traveled to the Maya Amador, where it's like, whoops, Argentina. I think it's, you just don't stay in one place. And the wonderful Center of Latin American Studies in Barcelona. I think that was pretty much how it was managed. And obviously Neruda ran into trouble with the Pinochet regime, and so on. So there have been difficulties. And Garcia Márquez also left Colombia. So he's been back and forth, but still, it's that as well. Censorship is an important and interesting issue in terms of literary studies these days, particularly, I guess, in the way in terms of a writer writing with censorship in mind really does, and an audience reading with censorship in mind, really, they do change the work that one's working with. But I don't know much about that in terms of the Latin American context. It would probably be most applicable to journalism in terms of Garcia Márquez's own writings. But in terms of his actual work in fictions or poetry, clearly the writers of the 50s were very much in the forefront of exposure. And that was one of their purposes in 1932. Yes?
That was actually one of the questions I had, was how his journalism informed his fiction. Because some of the, when you're reading Spanish and English too, there's like a lot of details that you miss in both languages in general, just like on a literary level, but there's also like a lot of detail that goes back, I think, in some ways to his journalistic work, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
That's a matter of the Garcia Márquez style, which is quite extraordinary. It's like a mosaic.
Yeah.
And you can't, I think a part of that, he learned it doing journalism, doing a kind of pointed journalism, a journalism would have a point that would sort of spring out at the reader. On the other hand, the actual achievement of it as a literary style is accomplished in the fictions, because you can't really write journalism that densely, that richly, in terms of that patterned way, without losing credibility, that you couldn't quite tell the story with these kinds of juxtapositions and still earn the reader's acquiescence in the objectivity, the truth of your account. You can't jeopardize that. So I think that some of the tricks of foregrounding and backgrounding are learned there, but I think he actually learns how to do it by writing the fictions. That would be my suspicion. That's a stylistic matter. I mean, he actually afraid he's only a rhetorician, but then he also maybe Faulkner is only a rhetorician too. The really pretty language that he's learned.
Maybe one more question?
You had said that at that time you believed that no know American literature past Faulkner, do you still have that belief?
I'm coming around. Actually, Stephen Milhauser, actually, sort of blended Thomas Mann and Borges, which was my favorite writer. I have others as well. But no, actually, I'm more, I'm much more, because in fact the influence of Garcia Marquez and the boom on Latin America, on modern American fiction after him. That is to say that when we had the boom in the 60s, the way in which something like Toni Morrison could not write what she writes. Song of Solomon is not a book that was written in the form it does without years of the influence of that novel. That sends new kinds of literary resources of metafiction and of magic and of the super natural that is validated by that novel. Actually transformed American fiction and Indian fiction and fiction elsewhere afterwards. And there, obviously, Garcia Marquez was the only person who did Latin American fiction either, but there was a kind of giving warrant and importance and value to that remaking of reality, so that you're no longer having to talk about the dispossessed or the repressed as social realist victims, that they can create a reality of their own, which is what Morrison did and turned to in Song of Solomon, and then he went forward from there. Yeah, I read a lot more, but hey, why?
So do they attribute their, Morrison, do they attribute,
Yeah. Because what happened was that it was a way of having a sense of new possibilities, new possible ways you could write, new things you could do with time, new things you could do with politics, that you simply opened up the resources of what you could do in a novel to the invention and the inventiveness of writers. And then have done very different things, completely different things, with it, who were kind of freed by this particular movement of Latin American fiction in the 60s, which is nice. It's quite wonderful.